Well, welcome everyone, including those who are watching on our virtual live stream. So thank you again for tuning in or being here in person. So welcome, Ambassador Khalilzad. Look, I'm going to start off, and hopefully this doesn't embarrass you, but I think the country owes you a great deal of gratitude for your role in ending America's longest war. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, just to start with. And so we're so pleased to host you. And, you know, Zal's had a long career as a representative of the United States, as an ambassador, as a thought leader. And if you haven't read his book, The Envoy, I recommend you do so. And I think that that would be a great way for you to understand someone who I think really has had a mark in our history. Again, particularly because Afghanistan, our longest war, was such an important part of our recent post-Cold War era. And hopefully we can kind of emerge out of this learning some key lessons. And so we're going to talk about the war in Afghanistan. We're going to talk about the Doha Agreement and talk about what's next. So why don't we start at the beginning, at least not for you when it comes to Afghanistan, obviously, but in terms of your role as the special representative for Afghanistan reconciliation. So what was the state of the Afghanistan war and the coalition war in Afghanistan, you know, when you arrived, and how did that impact how you went about your job in trying to find a diplomatic path forward?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great honor to be with you, and I know that your group supports and represents some veterans. I want to pay homage to the brave men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces, particularly those who served in Afghanistan and Iraq. I served in both countries and know firsthand the challenges they faced, the bravery and courage they showed, and the sacrifices that they made. So I'm very grateful to you and to them, if some serving officers are here, and those who have served. It has been my great honor to have served with them for so many years. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. And second, on your question, the war wasn't going well. After 15, 16 years, in Afghanistan, with a mission that evolved and changed from initially going after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and bringing those Talibs who had worked with or facilitated the dastardly attack that took place against the United States. It morphed into a nation-building, state-building, the transformation of Afghanistan. President Bush had the vision that evolved over time, which was that Europe had been the source of the world's security problems in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. That post-World War II, the transformation of Europe into a democratic, rule of law, a free market, prosperous economies came as a result of American leadership, and that now with post-9/11 environment, he believed that the Middle East, the broader Middle East from Pakistan to Morocco, the Islamic countries of that region were, if you like, the source of the post-9/11 world security problems of the world, and you needed the same transformation to turn that region of the world into a zone of peace, democracy, and prosperity. And Afghanistan and Iraq were going to be the two pillars of that transformation. Well, of course, transforming countries with different cultures, histories, specificities. The vision was obviously a very commendable vision, but actually to achieve it, the responsibility really lies a lot with the locals, each having their own path. But in any case, the mission in Afghanistan evolved accordingly. But it was very expensive. It wasn't going well, and the world had changed. That's the other issue. When I was invited to come back to the government, I had long discussions with Secretary Pompeo and other members of the Trump administration before accepting that we had big issues that were neglected, that we needed resources for, that were hard to get. And Afghanistan was absorbing a lot of resources, some 40 billion it was estimated a year, and yet we were not winning. There wasn't a path for victory. And terrorism had changed. There were many other countries that had bigger numbers of Al-Qaeda because we had devastated it in Afghanistan. And yet in Afghanistan, we were following this huge effort, a big military presence, very expensive. And that therefore the best thing to do was to see if we can deal with the problem of terrorism through a negotiated agreement that the Talibs commit to not to allow Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization that would threaten the security of the United States, and to have guarantees and arrangement that could assure us of that we would withdraw, and at the same time use that withdrawal to get Afghans to talk to each other in the hope of reaching a negotiated political settlement to end Afghanistan's long war of 40 years, because the war in Afghanistan had started with the Soviet invasion in 1979. So that was the goal, and the analysis that led to that mission for me was, as I described, change world, war not going well,
right.
Resources needed for other things, and to see if there was an alternative that better served our goals in Afghanistan and more broadly in the world.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing a kind of a reckless idealism that kind of creeped into our efforts there,
Right.
And I think highlighted most importantly probably by Bush's second inaugural, and then us trying to kind of realize
Right.
that. And I remember when I was there in 2008, 2009, you had the sense that there were people there making decisions that really thought that Afghan culture was malleable, almost infinitely malleable, and that we could do things differently this time.
Right.
And it seems like over and over again we get trapped by that notion that the American can-do spirit can make it happen.
Sure.
I mean,
Right.
but there were real constraints in Afghanistan,
Right.
right? I mean,
Right.
you know Afghanistan,
Sure.
tell us more about Afghan society. What were some of the mistaken assumptions?
Well, first of all, the can-do American attitude is one of our great attributes, of course, that for every problem there is a solution,
Right.
and that with effort and goodwill, we can solve it. But I think that sometimes can get us in trouble, and as you say, I think the problem was first there was a mismatch of kind of objective versus strategy and plans and resources. In order to do the vision of total transformation, we would have had to send maybe 400,000 or 500,000 troops, stay there for God knows how long.
Some people wanted that.
Yeah. So
an imperial project.
But Afghanistan, of course, is a very different place than the United States, a very different place than Europe, because Europe and the U.S. have similar cultural history. And they were developed societies before World War II. Although the wars of Europe, one can attribute it to multipolarity, the struggle for supremacy, hegemony. They were big wars,
right.
Although there were small wars that took place every now and then as well that became big wars. But in any case, in Afghanistan, you had a country that had been the product of global rivalry in terms of its current geography, of the Russian Empire coming southward from Moscow towards warm waters of the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and the British Empire going up and consolidating itself in the Indian subcontinent, seeking security from the raiding tribes of Afghanistan, but also to preclude Russia moving southwards towards them. And they squeezed Afghanistan, the two, and then declared it a kind of buffer. Essentially, there was an agreement. But it's made of different ethnic groups, 4 or 5 big ones, with the Pashtuns being the largest. And then there is also other communities with countries that share their ethnic identity across the borders. So you have Tajiks, for example, with Tajikistan, Uzbeks in Afghanistan with Uzbekistan. And there is also sectarian, mostly 99% Muslim, but Shia-Sunni divide. And for a long time, since its creation, although it had been part of empires that ruled that part of the world for a long time, but since it became a nation state within its current borders, it was ruled by Pashtun tribes, a particular tribe, a family that was dominating the country. But then, with the Soviets moving forward in the Cold War, we tried to keep Afghanistan independent by helping the central government and slow economic development. But there was, the Afghans fragmented because there was disagreement among them as to how to organize themselves. And they never agreed to a formula, and others were dragged in or came in support of one faction or the other. And so this has been a country that has been very resilient over time, preserved this culture and its identity, and has been very hostile to foreign occupation. I mean, it's very famous. Somebody coined the term, it's sort of the graveyard of empires. Empires come to transform it or occupy it. They end up getting stuck. Ultimately not succeeding in doing so. So this was a very tough nut to crack. And initially we tried to make sure that we kept our footprint light, that we didn't give the impression of an occupation. Right. But unfortunately, over time, that changed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Let's move forward to Doha. Critics of the Doha Agreement and Afghanistan withdrawal, like H.R. McMaster, I know the favorite of many of you in the crowd, have argued that there were alternative courses that we could have taken, including keeping U.S. troops in the country indefinitely. Right. So they've even called our withdrawal surrender. Right. How do you respond to that? I mean, I find it egregious, and I'm pretty emotional about this, maybe too emotional, but it just is really frustrating, especially you talked about those veterans who have served year after year, multiple deployments, Americans still being killed until the Doha Agreement. It's frustrating to see people say, oh, we could do this at low cost, when low cost means our children going over there, dying, tens of billions of dollars. So how do you respond to this argument that it was a surrender?
Well, I believe that two things have to be said. Yes, there is a coherent alternative point of view that you can have, but it was just not sustainable. It was not, and that would have been that we should stay there and send the troops, the numbers as needed for as long as it takes until we prevail. That is a coherent view. This is vital for our national security. We must prevail. We will do what it takes to do so. First, we weren't doing what it takes before, and what we were doing was not working. It was costly. It was the opportunity cost was great because the president wanted to put resources against, let's say, something that China was doing, whether on intel or on something else, but they weren't available because we were spending $40 billion in Afghanistan, which we weren't winning. But if you judge, and presidents decide this, not the representatives, that when the president decides, no, I'm not going to, I give you within constraints that he had set, freedom to do what you needed to do to win the war. And we dropped the mother of bomb or whatever. And we weren't going to do a kind of 10,000-kilometer screwdriver telling you, don't target this, do that. You have the freedom to do what you needed to do. And send the resources that were sustainable. And we still were losing ground. Then we needed to find an alternative. And the alternative was to negotiate. Now we will talk, I'm sure, about the specifics of what we negotiated, or I could describe it.
Yeah,
up to you.
no, I mean, go ahead. I mean,
so the agreement.
Why was this a good deal? Why, or the best deal we could get?
Yeah, you always have to think about the conditions in which you're seeking a deal. The condition was this was not sustainable. We were not winning. We were losing ground for the 7 years. From 14 to 21, for at least from 2014, each year we were losing ground to the Talibs. In other words, the Talibs were gaining more territory. And the situation was deteriorating otherwise, too. Corruption was out of control. Just as a footnote, General McMaster spent 2 years in Afghanistan to deal with the problem of corruption.
Yeah, how'd he do?
So I don't want to make it personal with him. But in any case, the elections was very fraudulent. 2 presidents were announced at what time they didn't accept the results. Many indicators were not heading in the right direction. So in that environment, when we started negotiation, and I was shuttling initially between Kabul and Doha, Doha with the Taliban, Kabul with the government, to reach an agreement initially between us and the Talibs and the government, so then they can sit with each other, there were 4 elements. One, and that the Talibs will provide guarantees and assurances that the soil of Afghanistan will not be used by groups or individuals that would threaten the security of the United States. And specifically, and that took a long time, mentioning Al-Qaeda, groups, terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, because for a long time they were refusing to mention that. Second, in exchange for that, the US would in phases withdraw its forces from Afghanistan. 3, that the Afghans, Taliban, the government, would negotiate with each other on a new government. And 4, that there would be a comprehensive ceasefire. And that the 4 were a package. The first 2, terrorism and withdrawal, opened the door to the second 2. The phased withdrawal was to take place if all the conditions are met over a 14-month period. Some wanted a shorter time for us to withdraw from. The Talibs started saying 6 months. I must say, even our president was anxious to
So were we?
Get the withdrawal, but over a shorter period of time. But the reason some of us were insisting for a little more time is out of our generosity and concern for the Afghans, so that when the Afghans start negotiating with each other after signing, then they will have 4 months to negotiate an agreement between the 2 sides. And that maybe if we put it in 3 months or 6 months, the complexity of Afghanistan, not enough time. 14 months was what we ultimately agreed on.
Yeah, so were you ultimately surprised by the Ghani regime's collapse that was so rapid? Did you think that they would actually be able to hold out longer? I mean, heck, they didn't even make it past our, they collapsed before we even withdrew completely.
Right. Let me say a word or two in between
as
to what the agreement, how it was implemented and what other things it had, so that and the agreement has 2 classified annexes, and there's been a lot of comments about that. One dealt with our phases of our withdrawal and the troop movement, so that's why it was classified.
Right.
Second was on terrorism. There's a lot that the Talibs were going to do that they didn't want out.
Right.
And besides, the Talibs agreed that as soon as the agreement was signed, they were not going to attack the U.S. forces for the 14 months.
And they kept that agreement.
And they kept their word. Not a single American was killed by the Talibs after the Doha agreement was signed. And surprisingly, we also got the Talibs in the agreement to agree that when they attacked the Afghan forces, we could come to the defense of the Afghan forces. We could attack them, but they couldn't attack us during that 14-month period. And we did. We killed hundreds of Talibs, maybe a couple of thousand during that withdrawal period, because while the Afghans were talking to each other, as when we were talking to the Talibs, the war was still going on until they would reach an agreement. So on the terrorism issue, we believe that the Talibs did deliver on preventing terrorist groups from plotting and planning against the United States and
that's
our
our
allies.
And that's our most important strategic interest there, right?
That's what got us there.
Right.
Go. And they are Al Qaeda is our concern, and number one, and number two is ISIS, which is the new threat. And Talibs are the worst enemies of ISIS. They fight each other. Until President Trump changed the policy, sometimes we used to bomb Talibs when they were attacking ISIS.
Not a good idea.
And he ordered to stop that. But in any case, the inter-Afghan negotiations started after the agreement was signed. It took a while because there was also a side agreement on some prisoner release by both sides as a confidence-building measure. But the negotiations did not go forward for two reasons. There was intransigence on the part of the government. President Ghani did not believe that there should be a new government, as the agreement specified that he was briefed on. He thought the Talibs should join his government. But the Talibs controlled close to half of Afghanistan's land. They thought, as part of ending the war, there should be a new government mutually agreed to.
And Ghani seems to have ignored the local balance of power, as if he could wave it away.
Very unrealistic in that regard. He didn't have, and he also was delusional in my judgment, because he thought the president was not serious about wanting to withdraw. Maybe he was listening to some voices in Washington or the country writ large. No, we want to be there forever. And that there would be a residual force. The idea of a residual force was there to do counterterrorism and for collection of intelligence, but only if both sides formed a new government and that new government agreed to
right. The Taliban were not going to accept us staying there without them agreeing to it.
The Taliban, they told me they could not agree to a residual military presence by the United States and coalition because they resent that of their struggle. And the sacrifices that they believe they made was to reject foreign occupation.
It'd be a great recruiting poster for ISIS if they had done that.
They said that, and that they would lose people and ISIS will gain people. But if there is a government formed involving the Taliban and the Republic, the other side, if that government for national interests of Afghanistan decides that the residual force by the United States or coalition is needed, that's a different matter. But President Ghani, number one, did not believe, that was a grand miscalculation, I call it, that the United States would ever withdraw. Thought Afghanistan was so important. It was close to China, close to Russia, Pakistan, Iran. Who would want to leave Afghanistan? And I said I was proud of them that they thought so highly of their country, but that was very unrealistic. And the second thing was that he didn't have a good assessment of the balance without the U.S. He welcomed at one point then the withdrawal, saying, now we will fight the Afghan way, and in 6 months we'll defeat the Talibs. The third and the most important was he didn't want to relinquish power. He knew that if there was going to be a negotiated settlement, given the realities on the ground, somebody else would have to be mutually accepted to head the government rather than him. He wanted to finish his term,
Right.
and then an elected leader take his place.
Yeah, it's too tantalizing not to go back to it. But you talked about how maybe Ghani, he didn't believe that we would leave, and who was he talking to? What were the sources of his assessment there?
Yeah.
I mean, was it simply that he misread where the country was, where President Trump was on this, and that maybe he was thinking that that ultimately the Pentagon, the foreign policy blob would win just like it always did,
Right.
that they would talk President Trump out of this?
Well, I don't know. Some of you may know President Ghani. He was part of Washington for decades. He had, he worked in the World Bank. He taught at Johns Hopkins. He had a think tank on DuPont Circle area called the Institute for State Building, or something like that. And
That's so unfortunate in some ways.
And he obviously had many friends on Capitol Hill and in the kind of Washington community. And he had many friends here. I mean, and he used to be invited as a guest of honor, as the head of state. He deserved that, to address various fora in Washington. I believe one of the mistakes we made is that we were just not tough enough with him, frankly. We didn't help him by being this Washington establishment, being so nice to him,
Right.
that he misread. As a result, he thought that's what Washington was and not what the president said. And I think that those who were his friends at the end, by encouraging him to believe that we would always be there, helped them. Well, maybe help is not the right word, but in any case, helped is miscalculation, which led to the debacle that we saw at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to defend Ghani, but it's not unreasonable to think this, given how President Trump was oftentimes served by people in his administration that really didn't maybe understand or agree with his vision for rationalizing the American approach to the Middle East, focusing more on China and on domestic priorities. So
Right.
it would be easy to read Washington that way, right?
Well, you're absolutely right, of course. And even official Washington, I have no direct evidence of this, but people would tell me that all the visitors who come to see him from Washington did not sing from the same sheet that I did. And I would sometimes argue with some of my colleagues, this is inside baseball.
We love it.
But that I used to have interagency meetings, and besides, I wasn't doing it on my own. This was ending a war. I had a two-star general, my military advisor, which represented the Pentagon. I had all other agencies of the government that you can think of who would have an interest in the counterterrorism issues with me at the table, negotiating with the government, negotiating with the Talibs. But nevertheless, obviously, other people would go and visit him, and they would tell me that they would tell the Afghans that we will maintain forces in Afghanistan indefinitely. There was a wiggle room in which, as I said, the president said, I could say that if both sides agreed for the longer term, post-settlement, we would maintain, if needed, a residual presence to do counterterrorism, but that was very much contingent on
and fairly
a number of
unlikely,
things.
right?
Very unlikely,
Right.
but some may have oversold
Yes.
that part to President Ghani, and which was turned out ultimately to be counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, yet again, the story of unintended consequences in U.S. foreign policy, and for some reason, the establishment continues to kind of make these errors. But
There was a head and body problem,
Yeah,
I think.
right.
That's what I would say to the interagency group often. That look, the president says this. This is what he said he will do. but the rest of us are not
Right.
kind of in the same place. But he decides ultimately,
I know.
and this is going to be a challenge for us, this head-body tension. In a book that I'm going to write about all of this, one chapter will be titled "Head versus Body,"
Right.
because that's what I used to use in my interagency.
Well, we have a lot of political
deliberation.
scientists here, so they'll enjoy seeing that.
Yeah.
So,
Bureaucratic politics.
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly,
right,
exactly. I mean, we see the same problem in Syria as well, right? Where Jim Jeffrey was essentially trying to mislead Washington about what was going on there. So it's not surprising. It'll be a book, not a chapter, maybe, on the head-body problem.
Well, I certainly did not mislead the President Ghani or the other Afghan leaders that I spoke with. I warned them of that they would be miscalculating. And I think President Ghani and the other Afghan political leaders damaged themselves even in the eyes of at least the Trump administration in Washington by behaving the way they did. Imagine in the midst of this withdrawal, the agreement with the Talibs, the President Ghani holds an election that's 1.2 million Afghans perhaps participated out of a population of close to 40 million.
Right.
So everybody, the Afghans were yearning for a peace to end the war. Every day, 200-300 people were dying. And there is a lot of fraud in this election. Mm-hmm. And, here we are at war with the Talibs and their support. And they announced, they hold two inaugurations on the same day. And I am confronted with General Miller, who was leading our forces, with the prospects of the forces that we were supporting. We were paying their salaries of these forces largely. Mm-hmm. Helping with sustainment, with equipping, with training, was going to split into two forces. We'll have another war. U.S. Afghan government on one side, Talib. Now we would have Afghan Republic, some fighting other Afghan Republic units, disintegration of the armed forces. And I think that I remember taking one of the candidates, Dr. Abdullah, to President Ghani's house at 3 a.m. the morning of the inauguration to negotiate some arrangement where the prospect of the fragmentation of the army could be contained.
Right.
And I must say President Ghani was quite intransigent and treated Abdullah quite poorly, and they didn't reach an agreement, and an inauguration was held. Two inaugurations were held. Secretary Pompeo goes a few weeks to try to, I had not succeeded, see if he would succeed. And he had something in his pocket which I didn't, which was that he would threaten them with $1 billion of cutoff of assistance. Right. Even then, they didn't do it. And it took some time with a lot more effort that we got then an agreement a lot later. So imagine what kind of people we were dealing with.
Right.
Imagine you're about to lose a war.
And let's start a new one.
And you want to start a new one, and you give the enemy. How much fun the Talibs had with this. And they would tease me constantly when I saw them. So what do you think of the election in Afghanistan?
So, we have to laugh because otherwise we'd cry, right?
Yes, indeed.
But
it actually deserves that one should cry about.
Absolutely.
Given the level of effort, the sacrifice
right.
that was made, and people not rising to the occasion, not seizing an opportunity, so terribly miscalculating, being so selfish about themselves.
And the opposite of statesmanship we saw,
exactly.
right? So
exactly.
What was this? I mean, yes, it's an indictment of those particular political leaders.
Yes.
But is it also an indictment of our 20-year effort to build state capacity there?
Yeah.
And thus, really, Trump was right that we just needed to leave. We were not going to be able to continue.
I have to say, I hope people won't be angry with me to say that frankly, I say I'm about to pull my hair. Because here we've been for 15, 16 years. spending huge sums of money, putting a lot of Americans at risk. I mean, those who serve, diplomats, of course, aid people, NGOs, contractors, besides our great military people and intelligence people who were there. And yet, we did not understand this place very well. It's a very different place than places that we are more familiar with. And we're always surprised. How can we be surprised, I used to ask? We should know every rock of this, whatever, godforsaken place, or somehow we should know, I shouldn't say that, but I will. That, you know, we get constantly surprised. How can that be? And we had some successes that there was.
But we certainly didn't have the necessary understanding of this place even after. Right, to remake it. Right, and
to remake a place.
I'm not sure that Washington understands West Virginia enough if we wanted to remake it, right?
I'm not going to get myself in trouble that way. But,
no, but in the sense that it's very difficult. We saw that through Great Society, right? That it's very difficult for any kind of centralized government to engage in a way that remakes a people, let alone one across that far away.
And in particular, we have to learn lessons from this.
Right. What are those lessons?
Well, looking back is one thing, but we have to do an honest-to-goodness lessons learned, and to question our ability to do these kinds of transformational things in a distant, different place we don't, unfortunately. Sometimes, look, this is not true only of Afghanistan, even in Iraq. We built this huge security force there too, and we spent a huge amount of money. Remember when ISIS appeared, the force began to disintegrate.
Right.
For its own problems, and some would say even in other places like Vietnam, going back, the performance of the security forces that we make. Why is that? Is it that we make these forces in our own image, that they become an appendage to us, so to speak,
kind of dependence,
dependent, operationally too dependent, that they can't operate on their own. If we are not there, they fall apart. Also about these kind of democratization projects.
Well, the people in some cases.
A lot of lessons. I think a lot of youngsters I see in the audience. Hopefully, some of them will do their PhDs if they do, or their dissertations or books. These are vital things. We're going to do a lot of finger pointing. Yes, what happened? Who did what? That's of less interest to me, frankly. For the national interest, doing a kind of lessons learned, a serious look at all of this, I think it would be very important.
I mean, part of it is that a lot of the people...
Be a little humble, I would say.
Exactly. Humility in foreign policy is something that the Charles Koch Institute is very important. You think is very important.
I think we definitely... because all of a sudden now I see the same people who predicted things that didn't turn out before, or predicting new things, like in 6 months this will happen.
Well, should we be listening to a new cast of characters, maybe?
Change is not bad.
Right.
Hiring a new team, for example.
Inshallah, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is will there be any accountability, though? I mean, this is a town that doesn't do accountability well. Should there be a commission on Afghanistan that doesn't just look at the implementation failures that we saw, and all of us regret seeing those scenes from the Kabul airport.
Terrible.
And I think you and I would agree that I think we would have done it better. But the fact is that we need to be considering the 20-year time horizon and what went wrong, and some of those mistakes, the kind of hypotheses, assumptions.
I totally support that.
Right.
We should learn from this. And I think the airport scene was disastrous, that no doubt was a result of two things, in my judgment. Maybe there were other. One, that for a long time, many of us in the government and outside and others thought the Talibs coming into Kabul, there would be bloodbath. There would be street-to-street fighting. So there was a sense of fear, and the Afghans could relate to that because that's what happened after the Soviet departure. And their departure followed by a terrible civil war in which Kabul was destroyed, not by the Soviets, by Afghans fighting each other. And second, that anyone who can make it to the airport, whether you have documents or not, you can get to the United States or Europe. These two things together attracted thousands of people to the airport and created the conditions, the terrible conditions and scenes that we saw.
Do you think that things would have been better on the ground if we had actually followed the Doha Agreement's timeline and gotten out earlier?
Number one, and two, that we didn't indicate that anyone who wants to leave would
allowed,
leave,
yeah.
and we might, if we had assumed that this would happen, we might have sequenced things differently.
And the Taliban was in a different spot months
Right.
later than they would have been earlier,
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. I mean, that has to also be looked at when
Right.
you say talk about the commission.
Right. So just looking forward here, because I think that clearly American foreign policy should be about American national interests first, second,
Indeed.
and third.
Right.
But I think people like you and I do care about what happens to Afghanistan going forward, not
Sure.
just for the national interests, it's because we're human beings. So
Right.
how should the U.S. approach the emerging humanitarian crisis there? I mean, are we facing a choice between a kind of isolationism towards Afghanistan in which we just stick it to the Taliban government because we would actually like them to fail, and humanitarianism? I mean, to me it seems like you're going to have to choose one or the other, because you're going to have a humanitarian crisis if you isolate the Taliban, and you're not going to be able to promote the failure of the Taliban in some ways if you do allow humanitarian assistance to happen and to unfreezing the funds.
Sure.
So are we going to be facing that choice where we're going to have maybe make the bad decision for the Afghans in a way that actually doesn't help us anyway in terms of isolating the Taliban?
Sure. This is one of the reasons this issue was that I left the government to participate and help debate on this, and because there is a risk that for political reasons we will do the wrong thing because what is it that our interest is in Afghanistan? Is it, as you said, that terrorism is the number one issue, and then humanitarian concerns, of course. And I think the administration from the Democratic Party side, as well as maybe the country writ large, feels that anything that looks like engaging Talibs toward normalcy and unfreezing of their money would be too costly politically. That most Americans believe that Talibs are terrorists. Many of our security people have a bad taste in their mouth from the Talibs. They fought, the Talibs fought them, and at the end although we achieved some of our objective, we didn't prevail in the way that they would have liked. So the easier thing to do, the politically easy, is to get Afghanistan off the kind of headlines and TV, radio, and newspapers, and let the Talibs suffer and learn. And I think that's wrong-headed in my view. I believe that the disintegration of Afghanistan, which if we do what I just described may happen, likely to happen, the state collapses. You get a civil war, a bigger civil war. The underpinnings of it are there for it to happen. Could lead to a state collapse, lead to more suffering, humanitarian suffering.
And radicalization.
And more radicalization, ISIS getting more empowered. And more refugees destabilizing the region, and even all the way to Europe, and perhaps some even making it here. And and ungoverned spaces in which Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups could reconstitute themselves. So, and if all of this happens, the political cost, I say, to the administration will be even higher. Imagine in terms of assessment on competence, on how it was done, how it was ended. It would look even worse in a year and a half.
And some of that would be pretty easy, right? I mean,
So I think,
unfreezing assets.
Well, what I think is the following, is that we need another, or the follow-up to the Doha Agreement, because the Doha Agreement, parts of it have not been implemented, is to sit with the Talibs. They want, unlike Iran, which wanted us out, they want their embassy to reopen, they want engagement with the United States. We don't agree with them on some value issues. There are differences on, let's say, women and women, and then there are issues on terrorism. We want to do more with them.
Right.
We should.
Right.
Because
Because that is our strategic interest, right? Any groups that have intent and capability.
I would say that there are things they want: unfreezing, normalcy, from various lists that they are on to get out, and what it is that we want. And we need to come to an agreement on a roadmap that in exchange for this, we will do that.
Right.
And to have it in writing, because the Talibs are mostly religious types of people, and they believe in the text a lot, and they read the text carefully. There are divisions inside, and they are a consensus organization. So they debate with each other. And then once they agree to a text, they I think to a large extent adhere to it.
Right.
And so that's my recommendation, and that I hope that I can help push forward.
So I don't like to usually assume bad intentions, but do you think that there's, you talked about the more kind of understandable, like, hey, we don't want to deal with the Taliban, we were fighting them, going from killing them one day to cooperating the next might be a little bit of whiplash for some people, although that is the way the world has traditionally worked.
Right.
Do you think some of this is actually, though, bad faith, that there are people who would actually like to see the Taliban fail so that the United States has an excuse to go back in?
I think there are people who are have nostalgia for being there, and it has its own positive side and logic. I don't know. I can't say with confidence that I know that some people are plotting and hoping and planning for that, but I don't rule it out. Some have said that we'll be back there in 2 years or so. So I think if terrorism was to come back, we won't deal with it the same way. We'll deal with it differently, perhaps. But I think we can. Our task should be, as a country, to preclude that, to avoid that, to have to go back, rather than say, let's not do things that could preclude it. But then face that choice. You pay now. I think politically my answer has been a little bit, but you will pay a lot politically, whatever, putting the military issues aside, and the cost will be much greater later if the disintegration that I talked about does take place.
Right. Now, obviously, we've praised President Trump for the withdrawal decision and that you carried out. And again, I think you and I probably would disagree with how it was implemented by President Biden, and I didn't like the dithering that happened. But I do give President Biden credit for having the courage ultimately to decide for Trump's withdrawal rather than for Biden's war. And again, I think the politics made that decision a little easier than it may have been, or seemed to some. But it did take, I think, some political courage to do so, and I think we should praise it.
That was the reason that I stayed.
Right.
I mean, I've been worked for many presidents, but all Republican except for Biden. And I stayed because it was my distinct impression that he wanted to implement that. But the way it was implemented, obviously, that would be debated and looked at how it could have been done differently.
But again, we need to look at that whole 20 years. Right. Well, hey, we're out of time, but thank you, Ambassador Khalilzad. It was fantastic. Really enjoyed your candor there. And hopefully that will help us all understand better the future of American foreign policy, not just the past. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.